Thank you, Corey, for a very generous introduction. I'm excited for this opportunity to talk with you all. 58 people are participating in this seminar. This is lovely, and from many, many different places all over the world. And I'm honored and pleasured to share with you in this coming hour kind of a bird's eye view of what we've been working on for the last 20 years in terms of autism, 30 years in terms of broader issues of research, and to share with you some of the findings that we've had over the years and some of the some questions to which we have yet to find answers. And I will share with you a specific one in a little while about fathers specifically, and also end with research that is really reaching its culmination these days related to triadic interaction, mother-father-child interactions in families with children on the spectrum. So I do hope to squeeze quite a lot. This is a precious opportunity to share all of this with you without going too fast, but to share with you what we've done. Of course, as you all know, all scientific work, and this kind of work in particular, is very collaborative. And specifically, Professor Nina Koren-Corrie from my university, Professor Nurit Yirmiyah from Hebrew University, and Dr. Smadar Dolev have been my colleagues all over throughout these years, and additional people mentioned on this slide, and the funding from Israel Science Foundation that helped us do this work. So what we will talk about today is we will begin with attachment in children with ASD and focus on attachment to mother initially. That will be our starting point. And then introduce this concept of parental insightfulness, the capacity to see things from the child's point of view, and how it relates to attachment in kids on the spectrum. Something that I feel is really important given some of the perceptions or misperceptions about the capacity to understand the inner experience of children on the spectrum. Then I will talk about attachment with fathers. This is actually very recent work. There hasn't been any work done on attachment with fathers and children on the spectrum. And then I will move on to triadic mother-father-child interactions and talk about this concept of a cooperative family alliance, and talk about how I will end with sharing some completely new data about how co-parental coordinated support facilitates joint attention and language development. So I hope to be able to touch on all of these things. The overarching perspective, very basic ideas I think that we all share, is that when I think about children on the spectrum and their caregivers, their parents, their families, I use this concept, this age-old concept of goodness of fit between the child and the child's caregivers, and that the better the fit, the more optimal will the child's development be within the constraints of what the child is bringing in to the equation. And in fact, that concepts like sensitivity or attunement to the child may be greater in the case of children with special needs compared to typically developing children. So some might argue that in the case of children with special needs, kids on the spectrum, the primary determinant of outcomes has to do with kind of inborn child characteristics. Whereas I entertain the hypothesis that actually with kids like that have special needs, the degree to which the social environment, parents, family, others, of course, also tune into the child, understand the child's unique profile and characteristics, is actually more important for the child's development than it is with typically developing kids. We used, a broad developmental psychopathology perspective in the sense that we take models from typical development, such as attachment, and this concept of insightfulness or the family alliance, all concepts and measures that have been used with typically developing kids. And we ask, do they apply also with kids on the spectrum who introduce or bring with them so many unique and characteristics and challenges? So do these things, these traditional important notions that we know from typical development, do they apply? Are they relevant at all? And our main trajectory, the way we think about it is, yes, it is very relevant. Talking about attachment with children with autism, talking about insightfulness, talking about sensitivity, talking about the family alliance is equally important. It's possible, and it's possible to measure these things using actually measures that are quite similar to the ones that we use with typical development. So another way to say all of this is that, if you think broadly about research on kids with ASD, is falling into one camp, which is the difference between these children and kids with typical development. And another camp, which is looking for individual differences within the group. So our research falls within that second category. We look for those individual differences and try to explain what the child brings in, what the environment brings in, and how they two coalesce to produce developmental trajectories. So let's begin our journey and talk about attachment in the field of autism. And if we go back many, many years, this should not be news to anyone by now. There were all kinds of ideas that not only, even older ideas that the roots of some of the difficulties kids with autism have lie in the domain of the relationship with the mother, but also other, so these kind of obsolete ideas. But also, if you look back at the old DSMs, you will see that part of the definition of autism had to do with abnormal, bizarre attachment or absence of attachment and so forth. And all of this really changed quite a while back, actually, in the 80s and 90s, where people began to actually do observational studies of autism, of attachment in autism, rather than just assume. And lo and behold, they discovered in these studies that kids with autism develop attachment to their mothers. All of these studies were with mothers. Differentiated attachment to the mother, very much like kids with typical development. And and in fact, many of these kids develop secure attachments. And meta-analysis in 2004 reviewed a bunch of studies, about 10 studies, and the conclusion was that about 50% of children with autism show secure attachment. Those of you who know the numbers, that's lower than typical development, where we would say expect something like 70%, but still that's a very significant group, not only developing attachment, but actually developing secure attachment, but yes, with a somewhat smaller proportion. So that was kind of the state of the art when we walked into doing our study. So at this point, had we not been on Zoom, I would have showed you slides of the strange situation procedure with a young child on the spectrum to explain how it is that secure attachment and autism can go hand in hand together. And what I will try to do instead, because I mean, I do have, of course, permission from the family to show the slides, but not, I don't feel comfortable doing this on Zoom. So what I will do instead is describe to you, and I hope you will get the picture in your mind, what it looks like, what a young child with autism looks like, what secure attachment in a young child with autism looks like. I'm assuming that you're somewhat familiar, at least, with the strange situation procedure, which is the observational procedure through which we observe and assess attachment. But anyway, I will be describing it as we go along. It's an observational procedure composed of 7 episodes of an infant or young child with a mother in an unfamiliar environment. And the idea behind it is that the level of stress increases as the procedure goes on. What we want to see in the child is the activation of the exploration system when the child is not in distress, and the activation of the attachment system when the child is in this distress, the capacity to use the mother as a secure base to comfort, to gain comfort, and return to exploration. So this balance of attachment and exploration, these two behavioral systems, as they're called, is what we want to see in a secure attachment. Our little kid here, he's 3.5 years old, so that's older than the infants that we see typically in the strange situation, but of course he has significant cognitive delay, this child, and he has a autistic disorder diagnosis that we confirmed. He's a child from our study. We confirmed that he came with that diagnosis and we confirmed it. He's nonverbal and has low cognitive functioning. And as the first thing you see in the strange situation with Ben is that he's in the corner of the room. There's a chair and a small table and Play-Doh, and he plays with the Play-Doh and he's completely absorbed in it. His mother sits at the corner of the room where she's told actually to respond to him, but to not initiate interaction. And so she just looks at him and he's completely absorbed in his own play, as you might imagine, given his diagnosis. And he barely looks at her, seems to be completely in the world in and of himself. There is a fleeting moment when he does glance at her, but that's it. The next thing that happens is an unfamiliar research assistant walks in and she tries to engage him, and it's very hard to get him to notice her at all. She leans over and she really tries to get him to pay some attention to her. He has a quick look, a very brief look, but you know, nothing, just playing with Play-Doh, seeming very, you know, at ease and no signs of distress, but that's what we see. And then there's a knock on the door that signals the mother to leave. I mean, she knows that that's what she's asked to do. And astoundingly, the second she approaches the door and is stepping out, our little kid leaves everything that he's doing, begins to run to the door. The door is closed behind her, and he is hanging on the handle, crying, and really clearly seeking contact, proximity to his mother, and very distressed by the fact that she leaves. We don't extend it for more than a few seconds when kids are so distressed. The mother comes in. His response is to immediately stop crying. He doesn't look at her, not even a single look. His head is turned down, but he reaches over and takes her hand, and they kind of walk from the door to the center of the room, where he leaves her hand. She bends over and gives him a kiss, and then he kind of leaves her there and goes back to his kind of place by the table, plays with and resumes playing with the Play-Doh just like he did before. So what we already see here are two striking things. On the one hand, the attachment system, whose goal is to keep proximity, close contact with the attachment figure in times of distress, is working very strongly in him, and the exploration completely stops. Once the mother is there, he very quickly, and that's the hallmark, one of the hallmarks of a secure attachment, is how effective the relationship is to soothe the child, to comfort the child. He very quickly is comforted by her presence and goes back to baseline. Now his baseline is of course a baseline of a kid on the spectrum, or this child at least, very self-absorbed and seems as if he is paying no attention to what's going on around. But this is, of course, it turns, as we already saw, this is not the case. He's monitoring her presence, and when she leaves, he's very upset. So what happens in the straight situation is that there's another separation, and he again is very distressed by it. And to make things worse, instead of the mother coming in, it's the stranger that comes in to make sure that we know that it is not being alone that's the issue, but separated from mother. So the stranger's presence is no consolation for him. And only when the mother comes back the second time around, this time he's very distressed, and he actually takes her by the hand and brings her over to where he was sitting by that little table with the Play-Doh. He kneels over, gives him a kiss, he quiets very quickly and returns to his play. So this is a lovely example of a child who doesn't, he has the autism diagnosis, doesn't have any eye contact with his mother, has no speech, and yet has an attachment, a secure attachment through which that relationship functions to comfort him in times of distress, and a very smooth and flexible transition from distress to being comforted. So that is what secure attachment looks like in a child with autism. So zooming out from this single example, I hope you have the picture in your mind. We had 45 children, only boys in the study. We carefully assessed them and confirmed the diagnosis, and of course also their cognitive functioning was assessed. And we the important thing in this slide here is to notice that 44% of the children had secure attachments to their mother. It's very similar to this kind of prototypic secure kid that I just described to you. And this number 44 is quite close to the 50% in the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier. So it confirmed that we got the same picture in our lab, and various different types of insecure attachment that I won't get into right now. So the next question we asked ourselves, what lies at the root of secure attachment in the case of children with autism? And our previous studies have proposed that parental insightfulness, the capacity to see and feel things from the child's point of view, is what provides the basis for the kind of caregiving that promotes secure attachment in children. So what do we mean by parental insightfulness, and how do we assess it? Well, it's a video replay procedure where we show video clips and of the child to the mother or the father, and interview them about the child's thoughts and feelings. And we identify an insightful orientation as being reflected in when the parent considers the motives underlying the behavior, not just to talk about the surface, but to think spontaneously what might be the thoughts or the feelings or the wishes or the motives that underlie the behavior. Showing acceptance for challenging behaviors or disappointing behaviors of the child. Holding an emotionally complex view of the child, which means talking both about the parts of the child that are consistent with the parent's expectations and rewarding for the parent, but also about other aspects, and holding a holistic view of the child. Also with kids with diagnoses, not seeing the child only through the perspective of the diagnosis. And openness regarding the child and the self, meaning being able to look at the video and realize that your perception of the child, your concept of the child is actually revised based on what you saw there, okay? And interestingly and importantly, parents are not rated on the accuracy of their perceptions. Although we interview them about the video, it's not that we compare what they say to what is on the video. It is more paying attention to how the parent organizes his or her thoughts and feelings in relations to the child's inner world and behavior that is critical. So all that we judge is not whether it's correct or incorrect what the parent says, but whether in the parent's discussion of the child's experience, the parent can evoke motives, hold a complex view, show acceptance and openness with regards to the child. So this is part of this concept of insightfulness is part of the sensitivity construct that Mary Ainsworth, the mother of attachment theory, described. And we see it as the basis for responsive and emotionally regulating, nurturing parental behavior. So it's kind of the inner process that underlies these observed parenting behaviors. And therefore, it's the basis for a secure child-mother attachment, because a child who is the recipient of such a parenting approach feels safely held in the parent's mind. So in our sample, 42% of the mothers showed an insightful orientation, had got the insightful classification with respect to their children. I don't know if this surprises you or not, but when I embarked on the study, quite a few people, researchers, autism researchers, asked me, in fact, one very well-known person asked me, what's the point to ask about the insightfulness of a mother towards a kid who doesn't have theory of mind? And I was really perplexed by this question. I really didn't know what to answer, but I felt strongly that there was a point to it. And I think the data show that almost 1/2 of the mothers show this capacity. Even though these are challenging kids who are difficult to read, for many mothers, they are quite capable of doing that. And interestingly enough, and consistent with our expectations, this insightfulness was not related to the severity of the child's symptoms or to the child's cognitive functioning. So this is not the case that, oh, if the child is cognitively more developed or has language, it's easier to read them and then the mothers are insightful. And if they're not, then the mothers are not insightful. Or if the child has more symptoms, then it's more difficult. It's unrelated. It's more has to do with the orientation of the mother or the father. By now we've studied dads as well, towards the child. This is something a concept that we studied in typically developing kids, and here we applied it with kids on the spectrum. And we found, as we did with typically developing kids, that when the mothers were insightful, the kids were much more likely to develop secure attachments towards them than when the mothers were non-insightful. And just to stress again, this was unrelated to child characteristics, at least not the child's cognitive delay or the level of symptomatology. Insightfulness is not the whole picture, though. When you talk about parenting a child on the spectrum, there's another element which is very important and maybe unique to having a kid who has a diagnosis. In order to see the child behind the diagnosis, which is the essence of insightfulness, is really to understand this unique individual child. Parents need to transform their representation of the child in line with the diagnosis and to come to terms with the diagnosis. To go through this process of adapting their expectations, their understanding, their view of the child, based on the fact that the child is a child with special needs, with unique characteristics. And there's an interview called Reaction to Diagnosis interview, developed by Bob Marvin and Bob Pianta, that assesses the extent to which the parent is capable of really doing this adjustment or adaptation to see the child as they are with their unique characteristics and the diagnosis that they have. So now we have both the classification of insightful or not insightful on each one of the parents, and whether resolved or unresolved, as we call it, with respect to the diagnosis. And you can form a group of mothers who are both resolved and insightful, and that's on your right-hand side in this graph. 12 of the mothers of the 45 were both resolved and insightful, and what you can see is the likelihood that their children would be securely attached was very high, was 80%. And then if you go to the left-hand side, if they were unresolved with respect to the diagnosis or non-insightful, the likelihood was much lower, 20-some%. And really the same, surprisingly in a way, if they were positive on one of the two assessments. So either resolved and non-insightful or unresolved and insightful, because these two assessments are not the same thing. And you also saw a low rate of security. So although this is a correlational design, and we really do not know for certain whether it is, the resolution and insightfulness that promotes security or some other kind of pathway, but still this is consistent with our thinking about how these parental processes lay the groundwork for the development of a secure attachment in children with ASD. And all of this entire story appears to be quite separate, quite distinct than the child's delay or symptomatology that these processes seem to be more about the capacity of the parents, the mothers here, to see the child, to match, to perceive the child's signals correctly, whether or not, or irrespective to a large extent, at least, of the child's characteristics, such as severity of the diagnosis or level of cognitive delay. And in fact, in another study, we also showed that this capacity for insightfulness and resolution here on the left is fully mediated by maternal sensitivity in terms of the impact on attachment. So these kind of internal resources in the mind of the mother are expressed in observed maternal behavior, specifically mother sensitivity, and in turn this is related to the attachment of the child. Perhaps this is a point to one other thing to mention is that this insightfulness is also predictive of the level of inclusion of these children about 10 years later, in the extent to which these children were included or experienced more educational inclusion. Of course, it was predicted by IQ as well, but in addition, there was a significant prediction from insightfulness and attachment, and particularly insightfulness, with regards to the level of inclusion these children showed. So I can stop here for a second, and if there's a question maybe about what I talked about before I move on to attachment with fathers. All right.
I have one question, one quick question. Do you also look at the age of diagnosis for both measures? I mean, what age the child was diagnosed?
What do you mean, what age? I mean, just because we saw the children, the children were about 4 when we saw them, and they were all diagnosed, you know, between the age of 2 and 3, by and large, and all the children had, the parents were all aware of the child's diagnosis for at least 6 months before we interviewed them.
Okay, I mean, because of their resolve with the diagnosis, and if you have any insights about, because it seems to be very important player, so maybe sometimes it takes time to get to this.
Right. Yeah, we have more research on this, and actually one thing that is quite consistent is that there is no correlation between the time since their diagnosis and the resolution. And in fact, resolution doesn't seem to be something you attain and then is consistent, because you can actually move in and out of it. As all clinicians who work with parents with kids on the spectrum know that, you know, at certain milestones, developmental milestones, you know, the difficulties and the emotions around the diagnosis can resurface. All right, so I'm sorry, I guess people are sending me little chats here, but I guess I'm a guy, so I can't focus on more than one thing at a time. So I can't attend to these in the midst of speaking. So what about dads? So there's no research on attachment to fathers in autism. There's lots of research on attachment with fathers in typically developing kids, but nothing. So we decided this is a separate study, more recent, and we had 80 families, and we did the strange situation with fathers on 40, and the strange situation on mothers with 40. And so 80 boys, and also similar ages, so around 4, and also a wide range of functioning. It's very interesting. It seems that over the years, there are more kids with higher IQs with the ASD diagnosis. So these two studies, when I compare them, they were maybe 10 or 15 years apart. We have a much higher proportion here of high functioning kids. This is a current study, more or less, in the last 2 years. And here we had a surprise. So I call it when the peg does not match the hole. We begin to code the strange situations of these children. And the expectation is that, you know, the kids have attachment as usual, and we begin to code them, secure, insecure, etc., using our knowledge from the previous study. And the coders come to me and say, wait a minute, and in some of the cases, it just doesn't fit. This doesn't look like the strange situation. The child's behavior changes minimally or not at all in response to the changes in the context inherent to the strange situation procedure. The parent leaves, the parent comes back. You know, the child completely ignores. It seems like he's completely unaware of what goes on. The child is showing only exploratory behavior and no attachment behavior at all. Exploration has a self-absorbed quality. The absorption is qualitatively different than in typically developing kids. So it's not like a typically developing kid is absorbed. It has, you know, the kid is in a world in and of himself. And it seems like in these cases, you can't force the strange situation on these observations. I mean, you run the strange situations, but you can't code them as usual, because it doesn't reveal the child's balance between attachment and exploration. So very strange. And we decided not to to develop this new classification that we call not applicable. It's not applicable. Okay. And we look at the distribution, and lo and behold, this happens only with fathers. Okay? So A, B, C, D are the 4 attachment classifications. I didn't explain these, but I hope you know them. B is the secure one. And there's another one we developed, bottom up from our observations. A quarter of the kids with the dads show 0 attachment behavior. Dad is leaving, coming back, no, and this happens only with the fathers. So and when you remove that group, the distribution actually of the 4 attachment classifications is very similar between mothers and fathers. So other than these, 10 kids that are behaving very differently, the rest of the kids fall within the 4 regular attachment classifications, both with fathers and with mothers. So we try to dig into to understand who these kids are. Well, these are kids who have higher ADOS severity scores, lower Vineland scores, lower IQ scores, high autism symptom scores. So, these are the more involved children, but except that we have exactly the same kind of kids also with the mothers, and none of them show this pattern. So just these child characteristics cannot explain why these children are showing this behavior, because it was kind of random assignment of children to being assessed with a mother or with a father. What about the dads of these children? Well, they're not different in anything from the dads of the kids who show attachment as usual, except for higher depression scores. So, I realized this was kind of like we were looking on all of our measures to see what they're different. We came up with this finding, this higher depression score. I'm not confident if this is a chance finding or if this is actually telling us some interesting story about these fathers of these children. So we're left with a puzzle here. What is the story of these children with these fathers? The explanation must lie in some interaction between the fathers and the children. It's not only a child story, because we don't have any kids like this with the mothers, even though the kids were randomly assigned to be observed with mother or father and balanced on IQ and all of the other measures between them. There's no differences between children observed with mothers or fathers. So it has to be something in the interaction between these children and the fathers. And I think this is really, really interesting and important. One could imagine all kind of implications, theoretical and clinical. Let me pause here for a minute with this puzzle. I hope the puzzle at least is clear, and I'm also curious. I have 67 people who are listening right now. Maybe one of you or many of you have some ideas about what might be at the root of this kind of unusual observation.
You said that they were not different also in the measure of resolve with the diagnosis, the fathers?
Yeah, that's right. Not different.
I'm wondering, for those fathers, you're saying they have higher depression score, presumably compared to other fathers.
Yes.
Did you compare the depression score to mothers? I'm just thinking about that phenomenon where when mothers are depressed, they might smile less and might be less engaged, which might be having an impact on the kids.
Yes, actually, so first of all, to answer the direct comparison of depression between mothers and fathers shows that mothers in the sample report much higher depression scores than do fathers on average, okay? Now, I don't know if that is a reflection of higher levels of depression or it also has to do with the way mothers and fathers use self-report measures. I can't tease the two apart. The one thing we did find is this subgroup within the fathers compared to other fathers have higher depression. So this seems to be a more of the right comparison. And what we're going to do is actually code. We have other observations that have not been coded yet. This is rather new, these findings. And to see whether what actually happens in the interactions between these fathers and the children. And maybe we can get a clue from, that's an obvious place to look at interactions when they're playing together and not just in the strange situation.
And do you have any data about caring habits at home? Like if those fathers are less involved, for example, or?
Yeah, that's a great, I have to say I don't know who's speaking because I don't see all of you, but that's a great question. We do have some data on that, and we did. So is your thinking that maybe these fathers are just less involved in the everyday interactions with the children?
I was thinking about the body of research like Ruth Feldman, for example, about the mechanism that may be different in fathers in comparison to mothers, that maybe for mothers the attachment can be built more intuitively and fathers needs to work harder to build those hormonic processes. So maybe if those fathers are less involved, maybe something in the attachment is different. It's Yonat, by the way. So that was my line of thinking.
So we have some information about the involvement of the fathers, and we haven't looked into that yet. It does seem that there's more variability among the fathers in terms of involvement compared to the mothers. So in our sample, it's very hard. There aren't. I don't think there are any. No mothers are uninvolved in the daily caregiving of the children. But with the fathers, there's more variability. Some are very involved, and some do take a back seat. Seem to be taking a back seat to the caregiving of this particular child. Sometimes they're more involved with the other children, or just more involved in work or other things. So perhaps. Okay, so I will leave us with this puzzle, and maybe after we code more dyadic interactions between these dads and the moms and the kids, we'll have an answer. And I want to use the last little bits of time that we have just to give you a taste of where we're headed now. Everything I talked about till now had a dyadic focus, parenting focus, and also when we talked about the fathers, we talked about it in a dyadic way. So the father-child versus the mother-child. But what about the mother-father-child triad? And you know, there's a lot of research about mother-child dyad. There's some research about father-child dyad. In autism, very little, and even less so taking mother, father, and child together. But if you come from a family systems perspective or developmental systems perspective, you realize that, you know, the dyadic perspective is an important piece of the puzzle, but dyads operate within triads, and it's something to look at. And Elizabeth Fivaz developed an observational procedure called the Lausanne Trialogue Play that we used, and this procedure enables you to classify the family alliance, the characteristic way of this family to play together, to be together. These are two books that she has written about this. And this has all been done with typically developing children, infants and children. And we took this paradigm and applied it to kids on the spectrum. So a word about what the paradigm looks like. So the mother, father, and child are sitting around a table. and they're told, we ask you to play together. In the first part, you turn to one of the parents, it's interchangeable. You, mom, we ask you to play with the child, and dad, we ask you to be simply present. And then in the second part, we ask you to switch roles. So now dad, you'll be playing with the child, and mom, you'll be simply present. And in the third part, we'll ask you to all play together. And the fourth part, we'll ask you, mom and dad, to talk with each other, and the child will kind of engage himself. And that's the procedure. We did studies with it with typically developing kids, as did the Lausanne group who developed it. And now we took this paradigm with autism to see if it works, how it works, and whether families with kids on the spectrum can establish this kind of cooperative alliance that is the kind of optimal type of alliance, even though the child is introducing into the equation, significant developmental difficulties and interactional difficulties. What is the family alliance? The capacity of the mother-father-child triad to be engaged in the interaction while coordinating their actions and signals and working together as a team for the common goal, showing pleasure and flexibility. Wow. So that's a mouthful, and I'll just walk you through what it actually means in our observations. So Elizabeth Fiva's idea was that there are these 4 functions. These are these terms here: participation, organization, focal attention, and affective contact. And these are kind of hierarchically organized. And the more you move to the right, the closer you get to cooperative alliances. And the more you move to the left, the closer you are to these not so good alliances that you call disordered alliances. Okay, so it's hierarchical. First comes participation, then organization, then focal attention, and then affective contact. As you move up, the interaction is more cooperative, more coordinated. So let me explain what these functions mean in plain English. The first thing you ask yourself when you observe this triadic interaction is everyone participating? Are they looking at each other? Are their body postures in the right position for interaction? So for example, when you're asked to play with a child, you lean a little bit front to signal non-verbally to the child, I'm your play partner. And when you're asked to simply be present, do you lean a little bit to the back to signal to the other two, I'm watching, I'm observing, I'm part of what goes on, but it's not my job now to interact. So body postures mean a lot in this kind of approach, very strong and non-verbal communications. Are initiations of participants taken into consideration? So if someone is proposing something, are the others paying attention to it? Or is there what's called self-exclusion or exclusion of others? So self-exclusion, the easiest is to pull out your cell phone middle of all of this and to just, it's not my job to interact now, so I'm just looking at the phone. Or it could be other exclusion when you're actually leaning forward and coming in between your child and the other partner. You're basically making it impossible for the child to interact with the other partner. So these are the conditions for everyone participating. Then there's the issue of maintaining your role. Be active when you're supposed to be active. Be observing when you're supposed to observe. Not to interrupt the interaction. And maintaining this 4-part structure as I described it, the 4 chapters of the LTP, the Lausanne Trialogue play. Is everyone focused on the same activity? Are participants synchronized with one another, sharing focus? Is the activity co-constructed so that both the child and the parents are contributing to the interaction? Is the pace and timing of the stimulation appropriate, not too much and not too little? Is the play rich and creative? And finally, almost finally, is there warmth in the interaction, emotional sharing, or is there tension, criticism? And we also look at communication. Are there communication errors? How are they repaired? Are the transitions smooth? Do the parents work together? Do they interrupt each other? Is the child active in interacting with his parents? So taking all of these elements together in a complex coding system that I won't go into in more detail, you can classify the family into one of three general patterns. One is called cooperative, which really reflects the capacity to coordinate, have fun together, match each other, adjust to each other, divide the session into the 4 parts, and all of these positive characteristics. Doesn't have to be perfect. There's plenty of room for miscommunications, but the issue is repair. They're repaired rather quickly in these cooperative families. Then you have the middle group, the conflictual family alliances. There is an alliance, but it is conflicted. There's tension between parents. There's competition between parents about the child's attention. And then you have disordered alliances that can be very chaotic and difficult. And these are the numbers in typical development of the distribution. So, 50 to 60% show this, about 30-some% show this, conflictual, and it's at 10% disordered. So the question was, can you take this paradigm and apply it to kids on the spectrum, analogous to the way we did it with the strange situation, and the insightfulness? This is that point about developmental psychopathology that I was talking about earlier, taking concepts from typical development and applying them to autism, to try to understand what the child is bringing into the equation and what the parents are bringing in. So again, here's, I would have shown you a video, but this is not possible. So I will describe quickly what happens with this 3-year-old child with the autism. In the first part, what we see, the mother is the observer, actually. So she is very tuned in, she's focused, but she's leaning backwards and really giving the space for the father and the child. The father engages the child with a lot of positive affect, and the child is responsive and he smiles, he vocalizes, he doesn't speak, but he does vocalize in response. The father has all kinds of ideas what the child might play with, including with his horse, but the child is not interested in that, and it's fine with it with the father. So he lets it go. And also the transition, when the father needs to transition and let the mother take the lead, he does it very, very smoothly. He hands over the horse and moves back, and the mother just continues where he left. And the kid just moves to play with the mother. And in the second part, the mother follows the child's lead with spoon feeding game. He has this sing-song voice the child does, feeding this horse and feeding this horse, and she joins him in this. And when he doesn't want to, he doesn't go along with what she proposes, she says to him, "You don't want to play with this?" and moves on to whatever he wants. The third part is really where all three of them play together. They do play together, and they show a lot of pleasure and fun. When one parent makes a suggestion, the other joins, feeding horses, jumping over fences. So as a co-parenting team, these parents are really good at working together. And when they suggest different games, then they go with one or the other in a kind of smooth way. So there isn't competition or difficulties between them in presenting kind of something that is compatible for the child. And in the fourth part, where the parents are chatting with one another, the child engages with himself. You can tell that the parents there's a little bit of tension between them. And when the tension heightens a little bit, just in the tone of voice, the child leaves the table. We don't know whether he would have left the table otherwise, whether it has to do with this little bit of tension. But he returns after, they kind of lure him back to the table. So this is a great example of a cooperative alliance. So what do the numbers look like? So 41% of the families, out of these 80 families with preschool boys with autism, 41% show a cooperative alliance. So again, it's the modal category. 30% show conflicted, and 29%, which is much more than in typically developing families with typically developing kids, show this disordered alliance. It's very important down here, I mentioned, I didn't tell you a lot about the coding, but there's no allowances for children's autism when we code. It's not like we make it easier for the families to get the cooperative alliance because we take into consideration the child's autism. We do take it into consideration in certain ways. Can't go into the details right now, but essentially a cooperative alliance is a cooperative alliance. What's striking is this over here, you can see this is the level of functioning by alliance, and you see that the disordered alliance has lots of kids that are low functioning. So there's an impact of the child's functioning on the capacity of the family to establish a better kind of alliance. And when you look at the distribution separately for high functioning and low functioning, what you see, if you just look at the high functioning, this color, I don't know, pinkish, reddish, whatever it is, 51, 31, 18, very similar to typical development. So for high functioning children, the distribution of family alliances is very similar to typically developing kids. For low functioning kids, we see this high frequency of disordered alliance. So it's as if this low functioning of the children is making it much more difficult for the parents and for the child to establish more coordinated kind of family alliance. So our time is really almost completely up. I just want to mention in 2 or 3 minutes, what is all of this? So this family alliance business, or this, actually we divided it into a parental score and a child score based on these rating scales that we used. What does it mean? What implications does it have for children's development? And one of the first things we looked at was joint attention, thinking that families who are more coordinated foster joint attention more than do families who are less coordinated. So we also measured joint attention in these children using the ESCS developed by Peter Mundy, and we assessed the children's language because the idea being that joint attention is, on the pathway for language development. And what you see in this path analysis is that parental coordinated support, which is parents' joint behavior during the LTP, during the triadic observation. What you see here is that it is positively related to gains in initiation of joint attention. So these scores here are gain scores, positive change scores. So the more coordinated, I failed to mention that this is a short-term longitudinal study with 1 year in between time 1 and time 2. So, sorry about that. Parental coordinated support in time 1 predicts gains in initiation of joint attention and gains in response to joint attention. And it also has a direct prediction to language gains. But this goes through these gains in joint attention. This is what this path model shows here. So when parents are supportive in a more coordinated way in these triadic observations. This is associated with gains in joint attention, in initiation of joint attention, which in turn are associated with gains in language. So this is a kind of a very first step of understanding this triadic family interactions in autism. Just first of all, establishing that there is variability here and that many families are capable of establishing coordinated family interactions, and that this in turn is predictive of gains in children's, in this case, joint attention and language, and we're on our way to examining many other aspects of children's development. So I will conclude by this, and I'll be happy to take questions or comments or your thoughts in response to this material.
Thank you, David. That was absolutely wonderful. You have brought together different worlds, asking very interesting questions, using paradigms from different areas of knowledge. And I do want to say that that is really what we try to do here, is to bring together information that people can take from wherever they are and whatever they're doing. So first of all, thank you very much. Typically, this is where I get involved with organizing who's going to say what, but I am not going to do that now. Either use the graphic to raise your hand, or if not that, just unmute yourself, quietly wait to see if there's no one else talking, and please direct your questions to Professor Oppenheim.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, did you check a relation between the attachment of the fathers to the triad of the family, to the successful triad?
Oh, I see. No. So share with me your thinking. Why are you asking that?
I'm thinking involvement of fathers not necessarily says that the triad is successful. So maybe if a child needs to choose an attachment, it's going to be the mother before the father if the triad is not working successfully.
Yeah. So you're thinking that in these cases where we saw the strange situation, this may have this may be reflected in the triadic interaction?
Maybe, because you did the two of these tests, I thought maybe you have like insight about two of them.
So I haven't looked at it. There is a technical issue, which is the strange situation was done on 40 mothers and 40 fathers, but was not done on the same child with both mother and father. Those of you who know the strange situation know that you cannot run it twice because it's based on the stress that the child experiences, and the second time around it will not be as stressful. So what we did was do it with 40 mothers and for 40 fathers. So we don't have it with both mother and father, which would be then easier to address your question.
Sorry.
Celine? Yes?
I also thought to say maybe these 10 kids who didn't show any attachment behavior to their fathers, maybe if we look at in the trilogy, we can see maybe with the mother, the exclusion of the father. Maybe there is something between the, like, is there a possibility to do it? Like with these 10 kids to observe their trilogy?
Yes, of course. There is a possibility to do that. And we simply haven't done it yet, but we have the data. So that's a good thinking. Yeah, we can look into that. Thanks.
I would like to ask a question.
Yes,
I'm not on video. Professor Oppenheimer, thank you very much. It was very interesting. About the first part of the lecture, from my understanding, your findings are saying that parents or the mothers who are tuned in to the children, the parents who are accepting their diagnosis and understanding them more, contributes to the attachment process. I was wondering, what about the actual behavioral strategies or parental strategies that maybe the parents are using on a day-to-day basis with their parents? Maybe that's also something to look into to help out understand how the attachment develops through that kind of learning process.
Yes, and do you have any specific thoughts about behavioral strategies that you would look at?
And I have many, but what I mean is, for example, if a mother, the way she deals with a meltdown for a child, you know, so not just the cognitive aspect of understanding and accepting, but also the strategies that she's using to help the child. Maybe even some parents, they are accepting and understanding the diagnosis, but they're not using the right strategies, and maybe that also affects the attachment process.
Yeah. So of course, I don't know that we can assess all these behavioral strategies and what they do in a meltdown, but of course, what we have are quite significant dyadic interactions between both the mothers, between the mothers and the children, and between the fathers and the children. They're actually coded as we speak. So this will help to shed light on all of this. I'm completely with you that I mean, the child experiences the parents, not the parents' thoughts and speech about them, but the parents, you know, interaction with them and responses to them and behavior to them. I mean, that's the direct experience of the child of the mother or the father. We think that this underlying business that we call insightfulness and resolution is significant as providing the context for these behaviors. And as you could see in that slide, I mean, I ran it by quickly, you know, there was full mediation of these insightfulness and resolution through maternal sensitivity. So it is expressed in behavior, and that's, so we are on our way to code in this new sample of the 80 families to code these behaviors, and that may help us figure out some of these questions. Yeah,
thank you.
I have a slightly different question, not on the behavior, but on their actual, it's Nurit, I don't appear on the screen. The insightful mothers, the resolved versus unresolved, you said you didn't code for accuracy of their interpretation of the children when you looked at the insightfulness. So I was wondering whether you looked at, you know, differences in whether not necessarily accuracy, but in how they interpret their children when they are resolved versus unresolved. Maybe, you know, they're interpreting it in a way that's not appropriate for their child because of their unresolved.
Yes. How would we, I mean, how would we know when you say appropriate or inappropriate?
Sort of, you know, about what we know about what we already know about autism and what they are, at least our concept of what they're likely to be thinking or well, I don't also know however you assess accuracy. I mean, if you have ways to assess accuracy, that could also be relevant, but in general, maybe there's just, even if you look at first qualitatively to see how these mothers describe the thoughts and feelings of their child versus how the resolved versus unresolved. Maybe there's a big difference in sort of how they conceptualize the thoughts and feelings of the child, and that may be affecting the attachment because they interpret it differently, maybe, again, not appropriate for how they will later structure their behavior because they're, you know.
Yeah, but we do have, I'm trying to understand where your question is coming from. I mean, we do have associations between insightfulness and resolution and attachment. So there's not a problem there in terms of,
right.
you know,
Right.
Yeah.
We talked about the insightful plus resolution is much more correlated with the attachment, pure attachment. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe the difference, or at least you can get clues of the difference, you know, an exploratory look at the data you already have to see where the difference may be coming from through the concept of the mothers that are expressed in the insightfulness.
Yeah, that is something we can look at. We haven't done that. Yeah. Oh, so there's a question here. A lot of parents to children with ASD are with symptoms of ASD themselves. Yes, so that is something we are looking at. Also, we collected data about the broader autism phenotype in the parents. I don't have much to say about that yet because we haven't explored it in enough depth yet.
That's a great segue, David, because that means we're just going to have to ask you again to come and fulfill more of the information as you get it. I'm going to say that there's enough time for one more question if someone has a question that they need to ask at this point. I must say again, thank you so much for bringing together developmental psychopathology, developmental psychology, and most importantly, your amazing knowledge base and professional, skillful, empirical base of looking at these issues. And we really do hope to hear more about this story as it continues to unfold. And we can only say thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.